Hello everyone, and welcome back. Now that you're here, we can get back to recapping the spoilers of the latest chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen. This is an exciting chapter that leads into what is said to be the climax of the entire Shinjuku arc next week. So let's quickly get into the spoiler recap and then transition into some thoughts and theories before reaching our final rating of the chapter. The chapter begins with Megumi having some kind of fever dream, speaking to Yuji where he envisions his ideal world, where someone as gentle and pure as Sumiki would be able to live peacefully. And he thinks that even if that could never actually be a reality, at least he wanted to keep her safe for as long as possible. He goes on to fantasize about enjoying the little things in life, like eating basic meals and spending time with Yuji and his sister. Megumi tries to close off the conversation, but Yuji explains that his grandpa died from euthanasia after being diagnosed with lung cancer and resisting an experimental treatment, and how he has since come to understand why his grandpa chose to die, and the reality of those who face a harsh version of the world he lives in, filled with helplessness. And he's decided that he can't selfishly tell Megumi to live on when he is so helpless and has so much despair to deal with, similarly to his grandpa and others facing terminal illness. We return to the battle within Yuji's domain, which seems to resemble a picturesque countryside. Sukuna casts Hollow Wicker Basket to avoid the sure hit of Yuji's domain expansion. Unfortunately, this means that we currently don't know the effect of Yuji's domain, but it does seem to generate living beings as several ducks litter the battlefield. As Sukuna and Yuji square up and prepare to battle, Sukuna considers using Gojo's brain surgery method to restore his burnt-out technique, but he believes that it would be an even greater risk, considering that he's still suffering from the effects of Unlimited Void. This chapter frames technique recovery as something that Sukuna learned from watching Gojo, and not something he already knew, which was only speculated about by Angel prior to this chapter. The narrator explains that the output of a simple domain or Hollow Wicker Basket isn't enough to defend against a domain forever. Instead, it is a certainty that it will eventually be overpowered. But in Sukuna's case, he has managed to work around this by continuously maintaining the hand signs, which effectively supplement the output of the Hollow Wicker Basket to the point where it can confidently stand up to even a well-refined domain, as evidenced by his battle with Yuta before he body swapped with Gojo. Yet again, Sukuna's extra arms and mouth are now occupied, substantially weakening his ability to combat Yuji as they begin to swap blows. Despite this, Sukuna maintained a slight edge in their hand-to-hand battle, prompting him to begin taunting Yuji. Sukuna laughs and shouts about his surprise, as he would never have expected to be so enraged by Yuji's pity. And now he's relishing in the sadistic pleasure of telling Yuji that all of mankind will suffer the consequences of Yuji's choice to look down on him. Yuji has a vision of Kid Megumi from his encounter with Gojo from Hidden Inventory. Megumi asks Yuji why he's so distraught, and Yuji replies with tears in his eyes as he tells this representation of Megumi that life will be so lonely without him. And this actually manages to get through to Megumi for the first time in dozens of chapters, as he activates his curse technique to pull Sukuna's leg into the ground via shadows, granting Yuji a leg up in their battle. Meanwhile, Sukuna confirms that he cannot use his version of the Ten Shadows technique now that Maharaga is dead, which leads him to conclude that Megumi's soul has been freed from the bath due to Yuji's dismantles that have been empowered with a soul-attacking binding vow. This gives us a look into a very interesting question. Do Sukuna and Megumi have separate instances of the Ten Shadows? And it also seems to confirm that the Ten Shadows technique stops working after the destruction of Maharaga for some reason. But we'll discuss these questions in more detail after the recap is over. Back to the fight. Seizing his opportunity from Megumi, Yuji blasts Sukuna back with a powerful punch and dashes forward, unleashing a flurry of blows that Sukuna fails to dodge or guard against. After some distance is put between them in the midst of combat, they both manage to regain even footing as they grab and pound each other's heads ruthlessly. As Yuji's soul strikes begin to set in, Sukuna's ability to maintain Hollow Wicker Basket has finally reached its limit, pushing Sukuna to desperation as he heals his technique with Gojo's risky method and uses his technique to slash away Yuji's blood bracers. But Yuji isn't deterred as he readies a powerful blow with an evil look in his eyes that shocks Sukuna while he begins to summon his own domain expansion. The chapter ends with an ominous spiral staircase and what seems to be a poorly sealed Sukuna finger resting deep within, as the editor states the climax of the arc and potentially the entire series will be next chapter. This chapter has definitely kept up the momentum from the last few chapters and has clearly led us to the ultimate payoff for the entire arc. The choreography was impressive, the details and scenery of Yuji's domain were beautiful, and Yuji's ability to combat Sukuna has managed to stay believable, which I believe is a very important aspect of the fight in order to sell that Yuji deserves the win, which is the issue I had with the 7 black flashes he landed earlier. I personally value earned power-ups far more than explosive awakenings that, while exciting, border on ass-pull at times, and really serve to kill the stakes for me. It's interesting to see evidence that Sukuna merely uses a copy of the Ten Shadows technique and not Megumi's own innate technique, as he directly refers to his own Ten Shadows and Megumi's as separate entities. This further differentiates Sukuna's method of body hopping from Kenjaku's, who we see is capable of using the host's domain expansion in addition to mimicking their technique, which indicates the use of the host body's innate domain, which Sukuna can't seem to be able to do. This potentially means that Megumi can still have his own Maharaga and manage to be relevant in any future battles, assuming he manages to separate from Sukuna or regain control of his body. This does lead into my only gripe with this chapter, as I personally don't like the concept that the Ten Shadows ceases to function after the death of Maharaga, since it contradicts the rules established earlier in the series for the Ten Shadows, where we are led to believe that when a shadow dies, its powers are left for the others to inherit. I'm not really calling this a plot hole so much, since Maharaga has always been untamed throughout history, and generally an exception to the rules in a lot of ways, but it is disappointing to have this decision basically boil down to another convenient excuse for Sukuna to be less powerful. In this chapter, we get a slightly better explanation for why Sukuna's Hollow Wicker Basket is powerful enough to counter domains, but I always assumed that one had to maintain the hand signs for Hollow Wicker Basket to function anyways, thus granting it more power, but Simple Domain allowed for more flexibility, and I imagine that many of you thought the same as well, so this explanation does feel a little bit unnecessary to me, especially when you consider that Tengen said that barrier users on his level could counter domains with just Simple Domain during the Yuki fight anyways. I'm glad that Megumi has finally managed to break free of Sukuna's perfect hold on his soul. Even if his contribution wasn't significant in this chapter, it is the beginning of the payoff for dozens of soul strikes Yuji has been landing for the majority of the arc at this point, and hopefully he will be able to accomplish something a bit more extravagant in the next chapter. The ending of this chapter shows us an actual location in Japan, as Gege tends to depict in his work. This time, the spiral staircase seems to be the Shiromaru Gravity Dam in Tokyo. While it is hypothetically possible that this too is a part of Yuji's domain, the sheer distance between Shinjuku and the Control Lake makes it unlikely to be related to the battle at hand. I instead imagine that Sukuna's wide eyes are in reference to the strings barely holding together the finger, representing that it has been unsealed, which Gojo theorized would allow Sukuna to track them earlier in the series. It's possible that something like Nobara's technique can be used to deal devastating damage to Sukuna using this finger, but the question I'm more concerned about is how this finger managed to get here, when it was confirmed that Rika had eaten the last finger, allowing Yuta to copy cleave, which is most likely the same thing Sukuna is thinking when he senses the presence of this finger, which leads me to believe that this is some kind of backup plan hatched by Kenjaku, who separated Sukuna into the fingers to begin with. My working theory is that this is actually a 21st finger that Sukuna didn't know about, as weird as it sounds. Due to reverse first curse technique, Sukuna could easily have more than just 20 fingers that were made into cursed objects, as shown with him ripping off Yuji's finger to transfer to Megumi. Regardless of the mystery's answer, I find this to be an interesting twist for the chapter to use to bait us into being left on a cliffhanger for the climax. All in all, this chapter has left us with a lot to look forward to, and it did quite well to set up the next chapter to be the explosive climax that will finally exorcise the curse of Sukuna. So I'll be rating this chapter a solid 9 out of 10 for serving its purpose effectively, and we can only hope that the next chapter will be worth the hype. Thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, let me know if you'd rather more Jujutsu Kaisen themed Isn't Glazed Enough videos in the near future, or a different verse video like Danny Phantom or Samurai Jack for example. But either way, I hope you stay safe and take it easy.